a spirituality of the Psalms. So many scholars have tried to divide the Psalms up into different categories to help us to kind of get a handle on them. You know, royal psalms, psalms of lament, psalm of ascents, all those different categories. The problem is that for every scholar, they've come up with a different categorization, and there's no one agreed way of dividing the Psalms up. But what I'd like to do really quickly, as we move into this next bit of this talk, is to just take you through, in embarrassing speed, This is a threefold division of the Psalms, which I think is really helpful. It's written by Walter Brueggemann, and he calls it a spirituality of the Psalms. And he divides up the Psalms not by the 5 books or by the authors or by the literary types. Rather, he's identified 3 major themes that run through the Psalms. And this is quite a helpful way into the Psalms as a whole, hopefully building what I said a few minutes ago, that will fix in your minds 3 big picture things about the Psalms that will be helpful as kind of building blocks as we open up individual Psalms on these forthcoming Sunday mornings. Brueggemann talks about basically 3 categories of Psalm, and he calls them Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and then Psalms of new orientation. And I'm just going to take a few minutes just to walk you through those 3 types of Psalm, because I found it such a helpful way into the Psalter, all 150 Psalms. Let's begin then with the Psalms of orientation. The Psalms of orientation, Brueggemann says, are the Psalms when everything is right in the world. Everything is as it should be. God's people are walking closely with God. God is protecting them and blessing them, and life is good. And the classic Psalms of orientation are Psalms 1 and Psalm 2. Have you ever read Psalm 1? It's extraordinary. It kicks off the Psalter with this extraordinary picture of a land in which the godly are prospering. They are like oak trees planted by streams of water, and they are producing fruit, while the wicked, well, they're like chaff. They're not prospering. They're falling apart. God's goodness and God's justice is evident in the way that everything is. And it's wonderful. And it's an extraordinary picture. And it's one of those Psalms when people are having a great life and they're giving thanks to God for it. There's a strong sense of ought, you know, the way things ought to be. And it has very deep resonance with the kind of the deep structures of the way that God created the universe. You know, God created things which were good, and there would not, before the fall, have been injustices. There wouldn't have been things to complain about. Life was supposed to be good. God created it in that way. And some of those deep structures are still here despite the fall. Just as in glory, things are good. God's justice is done. God's people do flourish. And sometimes in life, those deep structures seem to burst through and life is good. Psalm 1, the righteous are prospering. And Psalm 2, actually Psalm 1 and 2 were probably originally one psalm together, is a coronation psalm, probably for David and Solomon, and probably sung for some of the later kings of less repute than them too. And in Psalm 2, the nations are trying to overthrow God's appointed king in Jerusalem, but God comes to the rescue. He laughs at those who would seek to overturn his king, and he rebukes them in his anger and sends them away, and he protects his king in Jerusalem. So here you have God, the sovereign God, and here is his chosen king, his representative on his holy hill in Jerusalem, and they are in close walking together, in close covenant, and God's protection is over the land. Psalm 1 and 2, everything is as it should be. These are the Psalms of orientation. And in these times when life is good, when things are right, when things are as they should be, we should be giving thanks to God and praising him, because everything good comes from God's hand. Every good thing comes from God. We sometimes like to flatter ourselves that the things we have are because of our ingenuity or our hard work. Actually, ultimately, even the very breath that we breathe comes from God. Everything we enjoy in life, physically, emotionally, relationally, all comes from God. And these Psalms of orientation that kick off the book of Psalms tell us to be people of gratitude, people of thanksgiving, not spoilt brats that just take things for granted in God's kingdom, but make sure that we honour and recognise that good things come from God. And that very often life is as it ought to be. Things are as God intended. Yes, sin and the fall have ruined so much, and every aspect of life is tainted in one way or another with the fall. But there are still beautiful things. There are still wonderful things. There is still good food to eat. There is the sight of a new child. There is a mountain to see. There is a sunset to see. There is the beauty of creation. And we see glimpses of God's goodness in one another. The Psalms of orientation give voice to these things. Just like Psalm 1, in which the good and the godly were flourishing and the wicked were falling apart, honours that. And Psalm 2, in which God steps in to protect his people. There are Psalms in which things are as they ought to be. And things in our lives too, which are just as they ought to be, which reflect the goodness of God's creative intent. And in those situations we can take up the Psalms of orientation and give thanks to God. We come next then to the Psalms of disorientation. If all we had was the Psalms of orientation like Psalms 1 and Psalm 2, that would actually be quite oppressive. It would have a kind of a form of prosperity theology that would just be awful, because we would not have the equipment in the Bible to negotiate the realities of life in a fallen world. Yes, things are often as they ought to be. That orientation is often true. It's often there. It's often our experience of life. But as we well know, life throws us so much more than things being the way they ought to be, which opens up the whole area of the Psalms of disorientation. There are many, many Psalms in the Bible which are David or the other psalm writers giving voice to their dismay, their bitter disappointment with life, with God, their anguish, their anger, their cries about injustice, their complaints to God, or their laments about the sadness in which they find themselves in. And these are really, really important. And they're especially important, I think, at the moment in this COVID crisis, because we need a language to express pain, and we find it in the scriptures. Psalm 88 is a wonderful psalm, even though it's the darkest of all the 150 psalms. Now, many of the psalms of disorientation gradually start to orientate as they come towards the end. You know, the psalmist starts out crying to God, but halfway through the psalm, God steps in and does something. Psalm 88, there's no glimmer of hope, there's no glimmer of light. God doesn't step in. The psalmist doesn't end the psalm by saying, but then God did something amazing. The psalm ends on a note of darkness. And it's so important that that lament is right there in the scriptures. I think sometimes we're tempted to read the Bible in a slightly trite way, not just the Bible, all literature, in a trite way, because we know the happy ending. It's like when you read the story of the death of Lazarus, you know that by the end of the chapter Jesus is going to raise him from the dead. And so the heart cry of Mary and Martha doesn't really affect us as it ought to if we didn't know the happy ending. And so it's so wonderful that Psalm 88 is a psalm in which we don't know the happy ending. It's almost as if God comes and sits down with us in the middle of our struggles. You know, there's that descent into darkness before the rise up, almost a picture of death and resurrection. And it's wonderful that right there at the bottom of that narrative arc, we have Psalm 88, a psalm of pure, abandoned darkness. And God says, even if that's where you are at the moment, here are some words to call out. Here are some things you can say to me. Natasha Moore is an Australian scholar of literature. She's a Christian, and she talks about our need for lament in these days of COVID. And she says lament is a really important thing that we adopt at this time. What is a lament? Well, she says this, that there are two lines. One is the way life ought to be, and the other is the line below it of where life actually is. And that awful gap between them is the space for lament. That's the gap of pain. And what she says is that sometimes we try to manage the gap by working really hard to improve the situation until the reality comes up to the ought. Or she says sometimes we reduce the ought down to reality, and that's just called cynicism. But walking in a life of faith with God allows us neither to pretend that pain doesn't exist, nor to downward massage our expectations through cynicism as if to say that this is okay. Because the monstrous intrusion of death and sin and pain and loss into God's good world is not okay. And the Psalms allow us to say to God, this is not okay. Things are not good and this isn't right. And Natasha Moore says, the Psalms of Lament tell us to get right up in God's face about what is not okay. And we find there that God stands in the gap with us. The Psalms of Lament, of disorientation, are so important at this time. Quick note before we move on from the Psalms of disorientation. You may be thrown as you read the Psalms for the first time about what we call the Psalms of imprecation. Now, the Psalms of imprecation are when the psalmist calls down curses on their enemies. And obviously, as New Testament Christians, we're quite uncomfortable with that because Jesus tells us to love our enemies. And when the sons of thunder say to Jesus, shall we call down lightning bolts on our enemies? Jesus says, no, that's not the way I do things. That's not how you're to behave. But yet in the Psalms we find some pretty brutal words about what they would like to do to their enemies. Now, how do we handle these? Because these are deeply disorientated Psalms. Many of them come from the exile. And I think the first thing we need to say is to have a little bit of sympathy for the psalmists. You know, they'd been, in the most brutal imprecatory psalms, they had been taken in exile, in deportations, and they were slaves in a foreign land, and they were crying out in anger against those that had driven them into exile. I think because most of us have lived such privileged lives, we've never really experienced anything like that. But I can perhaps imagine when you hear some of the stories of people held in slavery that IJM tell, for example, somebody crying out from where they're being held in slavery, some pretty nasty things about their slave masters. Or when I've spoken to people of my grandparents' generation who survived the Blitz, I can have some sympathy with them calling out some pretty brutal things about the pilots coming towards them with bombs. I think we need to have a bit of sympathy for the context. I think it's interesting the way that some of the Jewish commentaries handle the Psalms of imprecation. Some of the rabbinic commentaries say things like this: the Psalms of imprecation are so important because they give us somebody to complain to. What one Jewish commentator said, the person you need to watch is the loner who's got nobody to complain to, nobody to vent his emotions to, because then they become dangerous. Whereas the Psalms of imprecation make us safe because we've got somebody to offload all our anger to, and I think there's some wisdom in that. I think we also need to look at where the Psalms sit in salvation history compared to the New Testament. The purpose of the Old Testament people of God was to produce Jesus, a Messiah for the whole world. And so the battle between good and evil had a national aspect to it, which of course is no longer the case once Jesus comes and takes the gospel to the whole world, when our struggle becomes not against flesh and blood, but against authorities and powers in the spiritual realm. And so the battle has somewhat changed, and we need to bear that in mind too. But also, we need to understand that those cries for justice that come from the Old Testament matter today too, and that God is a God of justice, and that justice will be done. And just as the Old Testament people felt they could call on a God who was a judge, so too in the New Testament God is the judge. But we live today in the day of grace, when God is calling all people to come to him and be spared his justice. Yes, justice is coming. The great hammer of God's justice will come down at the end of all time, but now is the day of grace. So let's not think that the contrast is more than it is between the old and the new. And in that way, have a little bit of appreciation for the Psalms of imprecation. But the real point is this: people of God were in exile, they were in agony, they were in misery, they were victims of a tremendous injustice, and they'd been carted off to Babylon, where they were in abject misery. And from there they cried out, Lord, give us justice. They cried out to God with their pain. And in totally disorientated psalms like 88, they had a language in which they met with God, and God affirmed that this was not okay, that their suffering was not good, that God's good created intent for his world was not being met, that this is not how things ought to be. And in those psalms of disorientation, they meet with God. And we can take up those laments particularly and bring them to God, because life is very difficult for so many people at the moment. I know people who've lost jobs, who've lost income, for whom family life is difficult when there's lots in the house, or for whom isolation is tremendously difficult if they live alone. And sometimes the language we need, we find in these disorientated psalms that run through the Psalter, and God has put them there for us. I sometimes wonder if the genre of lament is one of the things in the church that we've really missed getting hold of and following in the biblical pattern. Several years ago, the theologian Carl Trueman wrote a really provocative essay. Mind you, most of his essays are really provocative, but this one was especially so. And it was entitled, "What Can Miserable Christians Sing?" And he looked at some of the diet of some of the modern songwriting, not all of it, but a lot of it is so upbeat and so positive and excludes the genre of lament that it can be very difficult if someone comes to church with real heartache and real problems. What do we give them to sing? I remember someone suffering from depression telling me they found it so hard when someone at church virtually said to them, "Come on, show some joy of the Lord," when what she actually needed was a vehicle to express her pain to God. And that's what the Psalms of Lament do. What can miserable Christians sing? Well, the answer to his question is the Psalms of Lament, or even to call on our songwriters today, not just to make songs which rightly celebrate the goodness of God, the love of God, the joy of our salvation, the freedom we have in the Spirit, and all the good things that they celebrate, but also to help us to give voice to God, to things like the COVID crisis, to things like loneliness and isolation and worries and loss of jobs and other things, because we need those as well. It's not that we shouldn't joyfully sing God's praises and thank him for all that he's done. Rather, we should have a broad palette like the Psalms, because the Psalms of Lament are sometimes just what we need to give voice to the realities of the days in which we're living. The third type of psalm that Brueggemann calls our attention to in his little book, he calls psalms of new orientation, or psalms of reorientation. And those kind of psalms are the sorts of psalms that people sing when they've been brought through their trial and out the other side. Sometimes it's as individuals, when God has stepped in and brought them through a tremendously difficult period in their life. Or, of course, in the big scan of Old Testament history, the psalms that they sang after the exile, when they'd been brought back to the land. So some of those psalms, like 149, 150, he identifies as the kind of psalms they sang in their new reality. They weren't back in the days of Psalm 1, when they just assumed that God would always protect them, that they would always be in the land, that they would have a king, and that everything would be right in the world. Rather, they'd been deeply scarred, deeply affected by the exile, but yet they were giving thanks to God back in the land. They were worshipping God in a new reality, in this new orientation. Of course, they didn't have a king. So many of those psalms related to the promises of God, to the line of David. And after the exile, they had no king. The next king they would have was called Herod, and he was a pretender. And of course, that would be followed by Jesus, the real king who inhabited all the promises given to the line of David. But when they first came back to the land, they had been through this tremendous disorientation, and they were putting things back together, and they were realizing that yes, God was still good, that God was still in control, that God was still worthy of their worship, and they processed up to the temple in this new orientation, this new reality. Things would never quite be as they were before, but yet God had brought them through. And of course, that isn't just the picture of Old Testament history. It is, of course, the picture of the whole of the Bible's history of mankind. Starting off in Eden, in a kind of idealized environment with God, and then down into the fall, into the depths of sin, and then finally through Christ being brought into a new reality, going through this disorientation of the valley of sin and coming up into God's new reality, his new orientation, his new life with us. Things will never be like they were before, but God's new reality will be even better than it was before. So Brueggemann's third type of psalm that he points us to is those which speak of a new reality, a new orientation when God has brought us through the trial. Finally, I'd just like to point out one last thing in our introduction to the Psalms, and that is that for Christian people reading the Psalms, we have a very particular way of reading the Psalms which points us to Christ. The New Testament picks up on several Psalms and says they were actually written about Jesus. Jesus himself, of course, would have been very familiar with the Psalms. The synagogues of Palestine when he was growing up, the Psalms would have been part of normal life week by week. He would have been brought up with these words. But as we read the Psalms as Christian people, which obviously don't name Jesus by name because they were all written long before him, so many of the themes that come through the Psalms we find reach their natural conclusion in Jesus. Take the Psalms of creation, for example, like Psalm 8, a creation psalm. We read in Colossians of Jesus that all things were made by him and for him. All things were made through the Son. And so when we read a creation psalm, for us as Christian people, we see Jesus right in there as the fulfillment of those things. Or if we go forward and think about the royal psalms, like Psalm 2, for example. Psalm 2, that royal psalm that we talked about before of the coronation of God's king, David, in Jerusalem, God's appointed ruler, his chosen man, like his son in Jerusalem, ruling under his protection, leading the people towards God. Acts, in the great prayer in Acts 4, we discover that that's actually a prophecy about Jesus, and that God's anointed one, pictured there as the king in Jerusalem, is a picture, a pattern, a prophecy actually pointing forwards to Jesus. And the person that would inhabit all those promises was actually Christ. And that everything going on there in Jerusalem when they first sung Psalm 2 was really prophecy for Jesus who would come. And then what about God, who they sing to? They sing all these psalms to God. But Hebrews tells us that, God was pleased to have all the fullness himself dwell in bodily form in Christ. God with us, Emmanuel, we are told. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. The Word was God. The Word was with God. He was with him in the beginning. And so the full revelation of who the God they are singing to in the Psalms comes when Jesus is incarnated in the world. This is God. And then what about the laments? It's okay for the Psalms of glory at each end, the Psalms of orientation, the Psalms of new orientation when God is being worshipped and glorified. But how does Jesus find us in the Psalms of disorientation, in the laments? The answer is, of course, at the cross. Because it was at the cross when Jesus stretched out his arms as they were nailed on the cross and he cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is the opening stanza of Psalm 22, that means, my God, why have you forsaken me? That Jesus calls out a psalm of lament. Now that's wonderful, because that means that just as he is God coming down to save us, and just as he is man representing us before God, he inhabits our psalms of lament. If we are sitting down in the dirt and the dust like Job today with misery and sadness and difficulty, it is almost in Psalm 22 that Jesus comes and sits down with us and sings a psalm of lament alongside us. Jesus inhabits our psalms of lament. And so we have this picture through the Psalms of orientation, things as they should be, of a decline into disorientation and exile and lament and injustice. And then the Psalms of reorientation, the climbing back from exile and going back to Jerusalem. And we see the same pattern in the life of the Lord Jesus himself. Think about his baptism, when the voice of the Father said, "This is my Son with whom I'm well pleased." That is orientation. Things are as they should be. All the way down to the cross, when Jesus calls out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" and lament. But we read in Philippians 2 that because Jesus was willing to give himself up even to death on a cross, he has been exalted to the highest place. And now every knee will bow before him and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Worship and praise will be given to Jesus. And what is the best form of worship and praise that we find in Scripture? It's these Psalms, the Psalms of praise. And so Jesus joins us in the arc of human history. From orientation into disorientation into new orientation, we find all these voices, all these moods found in the Psalms. They allow us to give voice to all these experiences. And so this is how we kind of put it all together. These wonderful Psalms, these songs, this songbook that God has given us, allow us to approach him wherever we are today, whether our life is full of joy or whether sorrow, whether we are walking closely with him or we've fallen into sin. God has given us here a vocabulary with which to approach him. Times when things are as they should be, we can come to God. Times when things are broken and damaged, we can come to God. And times when he's putting it all back together again, we can come to God. And we do so because Christ is with us, because he is for us, because he is here and we are united to him. United to him when things are good, orientated, united to him in disorientation, and we will be united to him in the new orientation, which will be his glorious future for us all. Let's sing the Psalms together.